Chapter 1. The Ascent. The Jeep growled up the narrow Andean trail, its tires biting into the rutted earth as dust spun in gritty clouds around it. The sky sagged overhead, a bruised gray, heavy with clouds that clung to the jagged peaks. The landscape stretched out in harsh strokes, rust-red rock faces scarred by wind, tufts of brittle ichu grass trembling in the breeze, and skeletal quinoa stalks leaning like mourners. Above, a condor traced slow circles, its shadow slicing across the mountainside. A faint hum pulsed through the air, low and deep, less a sound than a vibration Elise Cameron felt in her chest, as if the mountain itself were exhaling. Elise gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale against the cracked leather. At 34, she was a geologist, but her hazel eyes carried shadows deeper than her years, etched by the loss of her younger sister, Mara, who'd vanished 2 years ago while mapping Bolivia's forgotten mines. Her chestnut hair was scraped into a messy bun, strands escaping like threads of her fraying resolve. Grief was her constant companion, a weight she bore silently. On the passenger seat lay Mara's field notebook, its cover stamped with her name in faded ink. A photo slipped free, 2 sisters laughing, arms around each other, Colorado peaks rising behind them. Mara's grin was bright, alive, a memory that cut Elise every time she looked at it. "Almost there, Mara," she muttered, her voice rough from days of solitude. "Hang on." The trail steepened, a sheer drop yawning on one side, a crumbling cliff looming on the other. A weathered wooden cross tilted near the edge, marking where the earth had slid away, taking something or someone with it. Elise's gaze lingered, a chill tracing her spine, before she jerked her focus back to the path. The Jeep's engine sputtered, straining against the altitude, and she slammed the gear shift, coaxing it forward with a whispered curse. Ahead, Kulupata emerged from the haze, a cluster of adobe huts clinging to the mountainside like barnacles on a shipwreck. Thin wisps of smoke curled from chimneys, gray against the vast peaks. The houses were squat, their walls stained with age, tin roofs glinting dully. A few alpacas wandered near a stone wall, their wool matted with dust, their dark eyes vacant. The village felt suspended, caught between life and oblivion, as if it had been carved from the mountain and left to wither. Elise eased the Jeep to a stop at the village's edge, the engine coughing into silence. She stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, and slung her backpack over her shoulder. The air bit at her lungs, thin, cold, tasting of minerals and a faint sourness, like decay carried on the wind. She shielded her eyes, scanning the village. Locals, Aymara men and women in woven ponchos and wide-brimmed hats, paused their tasks. A woman grinding coca leaves with a stone pestle, her hands slow and deliberate. A man leading a donkey laden with firewood, his poncho flapping. Their faces were weathered, eyes dark and unreadable, watching her with a stillness that prickled her skin. "Hola," Elise called, her voice cracking the quiet. "Alguien habla inglés?" The words hung unanswered. The woman with the coca leaves lowered her gaze, resuming her work as if Elise were invisible. The man tugged the donkey onward, his back a silent rebuke. A child peeked from behind a wall, small, barefoot, clutching a rag doll with one missing eye, then darted away as Elise stepped forward. The silence pressed down, heavy and unnatural, broken only by the wind's low moan through the rocks. She trudged toward a shack at the village's edge, its crooked sign peeling with alcalere, for rent. The building was rough, its adobe walls cracked, its single window smeared with grime. A rusted padlock swayed from the door. Elise knocked, the sound sharp in the stillness. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Doña Rosa, a wiry woman in her 60s with a face like carved stone. Her black braids were streaked with gray, her eyes narrowed beneath a felt hat. She clutched a shawl, sizing a lace up with suspicion. ¿Qué quieres? Doña Rosa asked, her Spanish clip on rough. Necesito un lugar para quedarme, Elise said, stumbling over her Spanish. ¿Está disponible? Doña Rosa grunted, fishing a key from her shawl. She unlocked the door and shoved it open, revealing a dim interior. A dirt floor, a sagging cot, a wooden table scarred with knife marks. A kerosene lamp flickered in the corner, casting jittery shadows. The air was stale, thick with earth and something sour. 500 bolivianos, una semana, she said, holding out a gnarled hand. Elise paid, pressing cash into her palm. Doña Rosa pointed at the mountain behind the shack, a dark mine entrance scarring its base, framed by rotting timbers. No vayas allá. La montaña no duerme, she warned, her voice low and sharp. She turned and shuffled away, vanishing into the village without a glance back. Inside, Elise unpacked with care, a laptop, a geological hammer, a recorder, Mara's journal. She set their photo on the table, tracing Mara's face with her fingertip, a ritual to steady herself. The journal's last entry read, "Found a tunnel in the silver mine, not on any maps. Something's off." The light outside faded to orange, the shack creaking as the cold deepened. She powered on her recorder and spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. March 16th, 2025. Culupata, Bolivia. Day 1. I'm here, Mara, following your trail. She crossed to the window, wiping the grime with her sleeve. The village was still, the locals gone indoors, the mine gaping in the distance like a wound. Then she heard it, a low, rhythmic hum, faint but insistent, like the mountain breathing. It pulsed in her chest, her bones. Dust sifted from the ceiling. She grabbed her recorder, whispering, "What the hell is that?" The hum grew, layering into faint voices, too soft to decipher. A shadow flickered outside, gone when she looked. The night was empty, the mountain looming against a starless sky. Elise sank onto the cot, clutching her jacket. "I'm not leaving until I know what happened to you," she said to Mara's photo. The hum returned, softer, a whisper in the dark, unnoticed as she closed her eyes. Chapter 2. The First Trace. Elise woke to a stillness that pressed against her ears, the kind of quiet that felt alive, watchful. The shack was cold, the kerosene lamp's weak glow long extinguished. She lay on the cot, her breath fogging faintly in the dim pre-dawn light that seeped through the grimy window. The mountain's hum lingered in her memory, a dream she couldn't shake. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, her jacket still draped over her like a shield against the night's chill. Her gaze fell on Mara's photo on the table, the sisters' smiles a stark contrast to the gloom. She reached for the journal beside it, flipping through its pages, notes on rock formations, sketches of fault lines, until she stopped at that circled entry. "Found a tunnel in the silver mine. Something's off." The words gnawed at her, a thread she couldn't let go. She stood, stretching stiff limbs, and crossed to the window. Outside, Culupata slept under a shroud of mist, the mountain silhouette looming like a sentinel. The mine entrance gaped in the distance, a black maw that seemed to stare back. A faint creak broke the silence, the shack settling, she told herself. She turned to her gear, powering on her laptop to log the previous night's recording. The hum replayed through the speakers, low and rhythmic, a sound that burrowed into her chest. She frowned, adjusting the volume, but it remained elusive, layered with something that might have been voices. She shook her head, muttering, "Just the wind," though the lie felt thin even to her. As she closed the laptop, a soft thud came from the door. She froze, her pulse quickening. The sound came again, a dull scrape, like something brushing the wood. She stepped closer, her boots silent on the dirt floor, and peered through the crack where the door met the frame. Nothing, just the gray haze of morning. She opened it cautiously, the hinges groaning, and found a folded paper wedged beneath the threshold. Her breath caught as she picked it up, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was a photo, Mara standing by the mine entrance, her face lit with an unnatural smile, too wide, too still. Her eyes seemed hollow, staring past the camera. Elise's stomach twisted. She hadn't packed this. She turned it over, finding a scrawl in Mara's handwriting. "It's waiting." The ink looked fresh, impossibly so, as if written moments ago. She dropped it, backing away, her mind racing. "No," she whispered. "This isn't real." The air shifted, a chill brushing her neck. She spun around, but the shack was empty. Cot, table, gear, all as she'd left it. Yet the silence felt heavier now, pressing in. She grabbed her recorder, hitting record. "Day 2, she said, her voice shaky. "Found a photo of Mara. Someone left it. I don't know how." She paused, then added, "I'm going to the mine." She shoved the photo into her pocket, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and stepped outside. The village was stirring. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked faintly, but the locals avoided her gaze as she passed. The woman from yesterday sat grinding coca leaves, her hands mechanical, her eyes fixed on her work. Elise felt their stares on her back, a weight she couldn't shake. The path to the mine wound uphill, gravel crunching under her boots. The mountain loomed closer, its presence oppressive, the air growing colder with each step. The hum returned, faint at first, then stronger, a pulse she felt in her teeth. She stopped at the mine's entrance. Rotting timbers framed a black void, the ground littered with rusted tools. She pulled out Mara's photo, holding it up. The angle matched perfectly. This was where Mara had stood. A gust of wind whipped past, carrying a sound, a low moan, almost human, rising from the dark. Elise's heart thudded. She fumbled for her flashlight, clicking it on, and aimed the beam into the mine. The light caught dust motes swirling in patterns too deliberate to be natural, forming a shape, a hand, reaching, then dissolving. She stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from her grip. It hit the ground, rolling toward the entrance, its beam flickering wildly before winking out. The hum swelled, now a chorus of whispers, indistinct but urgent. Elise pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound burrowed deeper, echoing in her skull. She saw it then, a shadow in the mine, tall and thin, moving against the dark. It paused, turning toward her, and for a moment she swore it had Mara's outline. "Mara," she breathed, stepping forward despite herself. The shadow vanished, the whispers fading to silence. Elise stood there, chest heaving, the photo crumpled in her fist. The mountain watched, its scar of a mine unblinking. She retrieved her flashlight, its beam steady now, and backed away. Whatever was in there, Mara had found it, and it knew Elise was here. Chapter 3. The Village Warning. The morning sun barely pierced the thick mist that draped Gulupata, casting the village in a muted, ghostly light. Elise stood outside the shack, her breath fogging in the frigid air, Mara's crumpled photo clutched in her hand. The image haunted her, her sister's unnatural smile, the scrawl of "it's waiting." And sleep had eluded her after the mind's whispers and that fleeting shadow. She shoved the photo into her pocket, her resolve hardening. She needed answers, and the villagers were her only lead. She trekked down the gravel path into the heart of the village, her boots kicking up dust. The adobe huts loomed like silent sentinels, their tin roofs glinting faintly. A few alpacas chewed lazily near a wall, their dark eyes tracking her. The air carried a tang of smoke and coca, mingling with the mountain's mineral bite. Locals moved through their routines, women weaving, men hauling firewood, but their motions felt mechanical, their faces blank. Elise felt like an intruder in a world that didn't want her. She spotted a small market ahead, a scattering of blankets spread with goods, coca leaves, potatoes, woven cloth. An old woman sat cross-legged behind one, her hands sorting coca with a rhythm that never faltered. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her eyes sunken beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Elise approached, clearing her throat. "Hola," she said, her Spanish halting. "Puedo preguntar algo?" The woman didn't look up, her fingers moving faster, as if Elise's voice were a gust to ignore. The other villagers nearby, a man sharpening a knife, a younger woman nursing a baby, stiffened, their eyes flicking to her, then away. The air grew thick, the silence pressing in. "It's about the mine," Elise pressed, stepping closer. "The old silver mine up there. I need to know." "Basta!" The old woman's voice cracked like a whip, her hands freezing mid-motion. She glared up at Elise, her eyes dark and fierce. "No hables de eso. La montaña toma lo que se le debe." "The mountain takes what it's owed." Her words were sharp, laced with a fear that belied her stern face. The villagers stopped entirely now, a dozen pairs of eyes boring into Elise. The man with the knife gripped it tighter, the baby's soft cries the only sound. Elise swallowed, her pulse quickening. "My sister," she said, pulling out Mara's photo. "She was here 2 years ago. Did you see her?" The old woman's gaze darted to the photo, then away, her lips pressing into a thin line. She spat into the dirt, a gesture sharp with disdain. "Los muertos no hablan," she muttered. "The dead don't speak." She resumed sorting coca, dismissing Elise with the finality of a slammed door. The others turned back to their tasks, the village exhaling as if released from a spell. Frustration burned in Elise's chest, but she knew pushing further would get her nowhere. She pocketed the photo and turned away, feeling their stares like needles in her back. The mountain loomed beyond the huts, its mine entrance a dark scar. That's where the truth was, not here among these silent watchers. She returned to the shack, her mind churning, and grabbed her keys. The Jeep was her lifeline out of this place if things went wrong. She climbed in, turned the ignition, and nothing. The engine clicked uselessly. Dead. She tried again, then popped the hood, her hands trembling as she checked the battery. The cables were intact, but the tires, her breath caught. Each one bore deep, claw-like gashes, too precise for an animal, too deliberate for chance. She stumbled back, scanning the empty village. No one was near, yet the cuts were fresh, the rubber still warm. A chill sank into her bones. She wasn't alone here. Not with the villagers, not with whatever watched from the mountain. She retreated to the shack, locking the door, though the flimsy wood felt like paper against her fear. She sank onto the cot, pulling out her recorder. "Day 3, she said, her voice low. "The Jeep's ruined. Someone, or something, doesn't want me to leave. They won't talk about the mine. I'm going back tomorrow." She stopped recording, her eyes drifting to the window. The mist had thickened, swallowing the village, the mountain, a vague shadow beyond. Then she heard it, a whisper, soft and fleeting, like Mara's voice on a wind. "Elise," it called, faint but unmistakable, drifting from the direction of the mine. She lurched to the window, pressing her face to the glass. The mist swirled, and for a heartbeat, she saw a figure, tall, thin, standing at the village's edge. It turned toward her, its outline blurred, then vanished as the whispers faded. Her hands shook, the recorder slipping to the floor. Whatever had taken Mara was here, and it was calling her name. Chapter 4. The Tunnel's Mouth. The mist clung to Kulupata like a shroud as Elise stepped out of the shack, her backpack slung over her shoulder. The morning was cold, the air biting at her lungs, but she barely felt it. Her mind was fixed on the mine, on Mara's voice whispering her name the night before. The Jeep sat useless, its slashed tires a silent warning, but she wouldn't be stopped. She clutched Mara's journal, its cryptic entry. Found a tunnel in the silver mine. Something's off, burning in her thoughts. Today she'd find that tunnel. The village was hushed as she passed, its adobe huts blurred in the fog. Locals moved like phantoms, bent figures tending fires, their eyes sliding away from her. The old woman from the market sat grinding kosa, her hands relentless, her face a mask. Elise felt their silent judgment, a wall she couldn't breach. She didn't care anymore. Answers lay ahead, not here. The path to the mine climbed steeply, gravel crunching under her boots. The mountain loomed, its peak lost in clouds. The mine entrance a dark scar near its base. The hum was there again, faint but steady, a pulse she felt in her chest. She tightened her grip on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the mist as she reached the entrance. Rotting timbers framed a black void, the ground littered with rusted picks and shards of ore. She pulled out Mara's photo, holding it up. The angle matched. This was it. She stepped closer, the air growing colder, heavier, thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. The hum deepened, resonating in her bones. She clicked on her recorder, her voice low. Day 4, at the mine entrance, going in to find Mara's tunnel. She pocketed it and shone her flashlight inside. The beam revealed a rough-hewn passage, walls glistening with moisture, stretching into darkness. She took a breath and crossed the threshold. The silence swallowed her footsteps, the outside world fading as she descended. The walls were jagged, etched with faint scratches. Tools, she thought, until she saw patterns, swirling lines, sharp angles, symbols she didn't recognize. Aymara, maybe, or older. Her flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced like figures before snapping back to stillness. She pressed on, the passage narrowing, the air pressing against her skin. Then she saw it, a side tunnel branching off, its entrance smaller, rougher, unmarked on any map she'd studied. Mara's words echoed in her mind, not on any maps. She aimed her flashlight down it, the beam catching a floor strewn with broken rock and something else, dried blood, dark and crusted, staining a pickaxe half buried in the dirt. Her stomach lurched. She knelt, brushing the handle. It was old, the wood splintered, but the blood looked fresh, too fresh. The hum swelled, a low moan rising from the tunnel's depths. She stood, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The beam swept the walls, revealing more symbols, spirals, jagged lines, a shape like a gaping mouth. Dust sifted from the ceiling, and the moan sharpened, almost a voice, pleading or warning. She clicked her recorder again. "Found it," she whispered. "Mara's tunnel. There's blood here, and something else." A shadow moved at the edge of her light, tall, thin, shifting against the wall. She jerked the beam toward it, but it was gone, leaving only stone. Her heart pounded. "Mara," she called, her voice echoing, unanswered. The hum pulsed louder, a rhythm that shook the ground beneath her. She stepped deeper into the tunnel, the air growing colder, her breath fogging in the flashlight's glow. Then she saw it, her shadow on the wall, stretched impossibly long, its edges fraying like smoke. She turned, but no one was behind her. The shadow lingered, moving when she didn't, its head tilting as if listening. She stumbled back, the flashlight slipping, its beam spinning wildly before steadying. The hum became a chorus, whispers layering over each other, too faint to understand, but too real to dismiss. She ran, her boots slipping on loose rock, the tunnel blurring past her. The entrance loomed ahead, a gray sliver of light. She burst out, collapsing onto the gravel, gasping. The hum faded, the whispers silenced, but the mountain watched, its dark scar unblinking. She checked her recorder, hands shaking, and played it back. Her voice crackled. "Found it. Blood here." Then, beneath her words, a faint whisper, not hers, not human, hissed, "Stay." Elise stared at the mine, the tunnel's mouth a void that seemed to breathe. Whatever Mara had found, it was still there, and it wanted her too. Chapter 5. The Spreading Cold. Elise woke to a cold that gnawed at her bones, sharper than the Andean chill she'd grown used to. The shack was dim, the dawn light struggling through the grimy window, casting a sickly glow across the dirt floor. She sat up on the cot, her breath fogging in tight, shallow puffs, her body sluggish as if weighed down by the night. The tunnel's whispers, "Stay," echoed in her mind, a memory that clung like damp rot. She rubbed her hands together, seeking warmth, and froze. Her fingertips were gray, the skin dull and lifeless, like stone kissed by frost. She stared, her pulse quickening, and yanked up her sleeves. The grayness crept past her nails, threading up her fingers in faint, vein-like lines. It wasn't frostbite. She'd seen that before, the blackened edges and blisters. This was different, unnatural, spreading slow and deliberate. She stumbled to the table, knocking Mara's photo aside, and grabbed her recorder. "Day 5, she rasped, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong with my hands. They're gray. Started after the tunnel." The shack felt smaller, the walls closing in. She glanced at the window. Frost traced delicate patterns on the glass, impossible in Bolivia's dry season. Her breath hitched. She crossed to it, wiping the ice with a sleeve, and peered out. Kulupata lay still, shrouded in mist, the mountain scar of a mine glaring down. The hum was faint now, a distant pulse, but it lingered in her chest like a second heartbeat. She needed help. She pulled on her jacket, wincing as the grayness brushed against the fabric, and headed into the village. The streets were quiet, the air thick with the scent of smoke and earth. Locals moved through the fog, bent figures tending alpacas, weaving cloth, but their eyes slid away from her as if she carried a plague they could sense. She spotted a small hut with a cross of coca leaves above the door, the home of the village healer she'd heard whispers of. She knocked, the sound sharp in the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing an old man, short, wiry, his face a maze of wrinkles beneath a wool cap. His eyes were milky, half-blind, but they fixed on her with unnerving clarity. "¿Qué pasa?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "My hands," Elise said, holding them up. "They're changing. I need help." He stepped closer, peering at the grayness, and his breath caught. He muttered something in Aymara, too fast for her to catch, then said in Spanish, "El beso de la montaña." The mountain's kiss. His tone was flat, final, like a diagnosis of death. He backed away, shaking his head. "No puedo ayudarte. Vete." "What does that mean?" she demanded, stepping forward. "What's happening to me?" He slammed the door, the bolt clicking into place. She pounded on it, desperation rising. "Please, I need to know." No answer. The village seemed to tighten around her, the silence a wall she couldn't break. She turned away, her hands throbbing with a cold that wasn't just temperature. It was alive, creeping. Back in the shack, she rifled through Mara's journal, her gray fingers clumsy on the pages. She found an entry near the end, scrawled in haste. "Workers trapped in the tunnel, 17th century. Spanish forced them in. No bodies found. Mountain took them." Below it, a sketch, a hand with gray lines snaking up the wrist, captioned "like frost," but worse. Elise's stomach dropped. Mara had seen this too. The hum returned, louder now, rattling the shack's walls. She grabbed her flashlight and recorder, needing to understand. She played the tunnel's recording, her voice, found it. "Blood here." Then that hissed, "Stay." But now, layered beneath, was a new sound. A soft sob, faint and broken, like Mara's voice trapped in static. Elise's eyes stung with tears. "Mara," she whispered, clutching the recorder. "What did it do to you?" She looked at her hands. The grayness had climbed to her knuckles, the skin numb where it spread. She flexed her fingers, and they moved slowly, as if resisting her will. The frost on the window thickened, curling into shapes, spirals, jagged lines, like the symbols in the tunnel. The hum pulsed, a chorus of whispers seeping through the walls, calling her name. She sank onto the cot, her breath shallow, the cold sinking deeper. Whatever had taken Mara was marking her now, claiming her piece by piece. She stared at the mountain through the window, its dark scar unyielding. She had to go back, to the tunnel, to the source, before it consumed her completely. Chapter 6, The Exhalation. The shack offered no refuge as night fell, its walls trembling with the mountain's hum. Elise sat on the cot, her graying hands clenched in her lap, the cold spreading past her wrists like ink seeping through cloth. Sleep was a distant memory. Every time her eyes drifted shut, Mara's sob from the recorder jolted her awake, a plea she couldn't ignore. The frost on the window had thickened, its spiraling patterns glowing faintly in the dark, mirroring the symbols she'd seen in the tunnel. The hum was constant now, a heartbeat that shook the dirt floor, calling her back to the mine. She couldn't stay here waiting for the grayness to claim her. She grabbed her flashlight, recorder, and Mara's journal, shoving them into her backpack. The photo of them slipped to the floor. She picked it up, her numb fingers brushing Mara's face, and tucked it into her pocket. "I'm coming," she whispered, her voice raw. She stepped outside, the mist swallowing Kulupata in a white haze, the mountain silhouette a dark wound against the sky. The path to the mine was silent, the village's eyes hidden behind shuttered windows. Her boots crunched gravel, the flashlight's beam slicing through the fog. The hum grew louder with each step, a vibration that rattled her teeth. She reached the entrance, rotting timbers framing a black void, and paused, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The grayness pulsed on her hands, a dull ache that urged her forward. She clicked on her recorder. "Day 6, back at the mine. I have to know." She entered, the darkness swallowing her, the tunnel's damp chill sinking into her bones. The flashlight revealed the familiar passage, jagged walls, ancient symbols, but the air felt heavier, alive. She followed the side tunnel Mara had found, its narrow mouth gaping like a throat. The hum deepened, a moan rising from its depths, and she pressed on, her light catching the blood-stained pickaxe still buried in the dirt. She stepped over it, her shadow stretching long and thin behind her, fraying at the edges. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls closing in, the symbols more frequent, spirals, mouths, eyes scratched into stone. The moan sharpened, a chorus of whispers weaving through the hum, her name threading among them. "Elise," it hissed, soft and insistent. She gripped her flashlight tighter, its beam trembling, and pushed deeper. The air grew colder, her breath a tight plume, the grayness creeping up her forearms. Then she saw them, shapes in the dark, hunched and wheezing, their outlines vague as if carved from dust. They stood along the tunnel's walls, a dozen or more, their forms dissolving when her light hit them, only to reform in the shadows. She froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Who's there?" she called, her voice echoing, unanswered. One figure shifted, stepping into the edge of her beam, tall, skeletal, its head bowed. It turned slowly, and Elise's breath caught. Its silhouette was Mara's, her slight frame, her tangled hair, but its face was a void, a black hollow where eyes and mouth should have been. A sob escaped it, the same broken sound from the recording, and the flashlight slipped from Elise's grip, clattering to the ground. The beam spun, casting wild shadows, and the figure lunged closer, its empty face inches from hers. "Mara," Elise screamed, scrambling back. The figure stopped, its head tilting, the sob fading to a whisper. "Stay," it breathed, the word curling through the air like smoke. The other shapes moved now, their wheezing growing louder, a chorus that shook the tunnel. Dust sifted from the ceiling, the hum swelling into a roar, and Elise felt it. A gust, cold and sharp, exhaling from the depths like the mountain itself was breathing out. "It's dead." She grabbed the flashlight, its light flickering, and ran. The figures didn't follow, but their whispers chased her, weaving through the hum. "Stay, Elise, stay," until she burst from the tunnel, collapsing onto the gravel outside. The mist swallowed the entrance, the hum fading to a low thrum. She checked her hands. The grayness had climbed to her elbows, the skin numb and heavy, like it belonged to someone else. She played the recorder, her voice shaking. "Day 6, saw them. Mara, or something like her. It's not just a tunnel, it's alive." Beneath her words, the sob rang clear, followed by that hissed stay, louder now, a command. She stared at the mine, its dark mouth unblinking, and knew Mara was gone. But whatever held her was working, and it wanted Elise next. Chapter 7. The Village is Dead. The dawn broke cold and gray over Kulupata, the mist clinging to the village like a shroud. Elise stumbled back to the shack, her flashlight dangling uselessly in her gray hand, the numbness now creeping past her elbows. The tunnel's horrors, the wheezing figures, Mara's hollow face, that hissed stay, clawed at her mind, relentless. She locked the door, though the flimsy wood offered no comfort, and sank onto the cot, her breath shallow. The hum pulsed faintly, a reminder of the mountain's grip tightening around her. She couldn't stay silent anymore. The villagers knew something. They had to. She pulled Mara's photo from her pocket, her sister's frozen smile a taunt, and grabbed her recorder. Day 7, she said, her voice hoarse. Saw Mara in the tunnel, or what's left of her. I'm done waiting. She shoved the recorder into her backpack and headed out, the grayness on her arms throbbing with each step. The village was stirring, its adobe huts stark against the fog. She made for a stone altar on the mountainside she'd glimpsed before, a crude slab stained with dark patches, coca leaves scattered around it. An old man stood there, his back bent, a wool cap pulled low over his eyes. He was the shaman she'd heard whispers of, the one who spoke to the spirits. He turned as she approached, his face a web of wrinkles, his milky eyes piercing despite their blindness. Necesito respuestas, Elise demanded, her Spanish rough but firm. Mi hermana, Mara, ella estuvo aquí. ¿Qué pasó? The shaman's gaze dropped to her gray hands, and his lips tightened. He muttered in Aymara, then switched to Spanish, his voice low and gravelly. Tú ya lo sientes, el aliento de la montaña. What breath, she snapped, stepping closer. Those things in the tunnel, what are they? What did they do to her? He sighed, a sound heavy with centuries of weight, and gestured to the altar. Siéntate, he said. She hesitated, then sat, the stone cold against her. He knelt, tracing a coca leaf over the stains. Blood, she realized, old and crusted. Hace mucho tiempo, he began. Los españoles vinieron, cavaron en la montaña, buscando plata. Despertaron a Pachamama, su ira, su aliento. Los trabajadores Aymara, atrapados en el túnel, no murieron. Ella los tomó. Elise's stomach twisted. Took them how? She asked, though she feared the answer. Su espíritu, he said, tapping his chest. Cada pocas generaciones exige uno más, un alma para callarla. Si no, todos caemos. He paused, his eyes narrowing. Tu hermana, ella fue la última. The words hit like a blow. Mara, Elise whispered, her voice breaking. You gave her to it. No la elegimos, he said sharply. Vino sola, entró al túnel. El aliento la llamó. Hace 2 años el pueblo se salvó. He pointed at her hands. Ahora te llama a ti. No, she said, standing, her gray fingers curling into fists. She didn't just wander in. Someone knew. Someone let it happen. The shaman rose, his face hardening. Es la deuda, he said. La deuda del pueblo. Sin ella, la montaña respira libre y nos mata a todos. He turned away, scattering coca leaves over the altar, a ritual to appease what couldn't be undone. Elise staggered back, her mind reeling. Mara hadn't vanished by accident. She'd been a sacrifice, lured by the mountain's whispers, abandoned by these people. Rage burned through her fear, but the grayness pulsed, sapping her strength. She stumbled down the path, the village blurring past her, and collapsed outside the shack. The hum swelled, a chorus now, threading her name through its notes. She fumbled for her recorder, her numb hands clumsy. Day 7, she gasped. They gave her up. The shaman said it's a debt, a life every few decades. Mara was 2 years ago. Now it's me. She stopped, her breath fogging, and looked at her arms. The grayness had reached her shoulders, a cold weight dragging her down. Through the mist, the mind glared, its dark mouth a promise. Mara's sob echoed in her memory, and the shaman's words rang true. It had tasted her now, marked her. The village had paid its debt with her sister, and she was next. She clutched Mara's photo, her gray fingers smearing the edges, and whispered, "I won't let it win." But the hum answered, a deep exhalation that shook the ground, and she knew winning wasn't an option anymore. Chapter 8, The Collapse. The shack trembled as dusk settled over Shulupata, the mountain's hum no longer a whisper, but a roar that rattled the walls. Elise sat on the cot, her gray hands, now numb past her shoulders, clutching Mara's photo, the edges smudged by her lifeless fingers. The shaman's words echoed in her skull. A debt, Mara's sacrifice, her turn next. The cold sank deeper, a weight that dragged at her bones, and the hum pulsed through her, relentless, calling her back to the tunnel. She wouldn't go, not yet, but it didn't seem to care. She stood, her legs unsteady, and crossed to the table where Mara's journal lay open. The sketch of the gray hand stared back, a mirror to her own. She flipped to an earlier page, desperate for something, anything, to fight this. Mara had written, heard it breathing, not wind, alive. Elise's throat tightened. She'd heard it too, felt it in the tunnel, that exhalation, the mountain waking. She slammed the journal shut, her gray fingers leaving faint smears on the cover. The hum spiked, a deafening wave that shook the shack. Dust rained from the ceiling, the kerosene lamp swaying wildly before crashing to the floor, its flame snuffed out. She stumbled back as the table lurched, Mara's photo sliding off and spinning into the dark. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of earth and rot, and the frost on the window glowed, its spirals pulsing like veins. She grabbed her flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, but the light flickered, weak against the growing chaos. A low moan rose, not from outside, but within, the walls themselves groaning, splitting. She spun around, the beam catching the dirt floor as it rippled, stones lifting into the air, hovering, then shattering mid-flight. "No," she gasped, backing toward the door. The recorder slipped from her pocket, hitting record as it fell. Her voice crackled through static. Day 8, it's here. The hum became screams, dozens, hundreds, a chorus of the trapped clawing through her skull. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the grayness dulled the gesture, the sound burrowing deeper. The window cracked, frost exploding inward, and she ducked as shards flew past. Her flashlight caught the wall, cracks spiderwebbed across it, oozing a black sludge that dripped like blood, pooling on the floor. It writhed, forming shapes, hands, faces, before sinking back into the earth. She lunged for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock fused shut. The air tightened, her chest burning with each breath. The grayness creeping up her neck now, cold and heavy. She turned, her flashlight trembling, and froze. The mirror above the table, cracked, dusty, showed not her reflection soundless, desperate. "Mara!" Elise screamed, reaching for the mirror, but it shattered, fragments raining down. The screams peaked, the shack shaken as if it would collapse, and she fell to her knees, the flashlight rolling away. She clawed at the floor, her gray hands useless, and found the recorder. It played on, capturing the chaos, her ragged breathing, the screams, and beneath it all, Mara's voice, clear now. "Don't come closer." The words cut through the noise, a warning from beyond. Elise's vision blurred, tears freezing on her cheeks as the grayness reached her jaw, numbing her voice. She grabbed the journal, hurling it into the corner, and lit a match from her pack, her hands shaking as she touched it to the pages. The flame caught, orange and fierce, then turned blue, unnatural, the fire curling inward. The journal burned, but the ashes swirled upward, reforming into its shape, untouched, mocking her. The screams faded, the hum settling back to a low thrum, but the shack was a ruin, cracked walls, shattered glass, the air thick with dust. Elise crawled to the cot, her body heavy, the grayness a shroud around her neck. She pulled out Mara's photo, now torn, and pressed it to her chest. "I can't stop it," she whispered, her voice barely her own. Outside, the mountain loomed, its dark scar pulsing in the mist. The hum breathed again, a promise that this was only the beginning. Chapter 9. The Offering. The night was a suffocating blanket over Chulupata, the mist so thick it swallowed the stars. Elise huddled in the shack's ruins, the cot her only anchor amid cracked walls and shattered glass. The grayness had climbed past her neck, numbing her jaw, her voice a faint rasp as she clutched Mara's torn photo. The hum roared outside, a relentless tide that shook the earth, and she knew hiding wasn't enough. The mountain wouldn't wait. A sharp knock rattled the door, splintering the silence. She staggered to her feet, her gray hands clumsy, and peered through a crack. Lanterns flickered in the mist, dozens of them, held by shadowed figures circling the shack, the villagers. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, ponchos swaying as they chanted Anin Aymara, a low dirge that wove through the hum. Fear clawed at her chest. She grabbed her flashlight, its beam weak, and backed away as the door burst open. Doña Rosa stepped in first, her wiry frame rigid, her eyes cold. Behind her, the shaman loomed, coca leaves clutched in his gnarled hands. Others followed, men with ropes, women with bowed heads, filling the small space. "Es la hora," Doña Rosa said, her voice flat. "It's time." "No," Elise croaked, her throat tight with grayness. "I won't go." She swung the flashlight, but a man snatched it, his grip iron. Hands seized her arms, the ropes biting into her skin, dyed red like blood. She thrashed, her strength fading as the grayness sapped her, her legs buckling under the weight of their pull. They dragged her outside, the mist coiling around them, the lanterns casting a sickly glow. The village was a blur, huts silent, alpacas staring as they hauled her up the path to the mine. The hum pulsed louder, a heartbeat synced with her own, and the air grew colder, her breath a faint plume. She fought, clawing at the ropes, but her gray hands were useless, the numbness spreading to her chest. At the mine's entrance, they stopped, forming a ring around her. The timbers creaked, the dark mouth gaping wider, exhaling a gust that reeked of rot. The shaman stepped forward, scattering coca leaves into the void, his chant rising over the hum. "Pachamama, Tomala," he intoned. "Take her." The villagers echoed him, their voices a drone, their faces blank with resignation. Elise twisted, her eyes darting for escape, but the ropes held firm. The ground trembled, and they emerged, figures from the tunnel, skeletal and hunched, their forms dust and bone, wheezing as they rose. Their heads were bowed, their limbs jagged, and the hum became a scream, shaking the air. She kicked, her boots scraping gravel, but the villagers tightened their grip, forcing her to her knees. One figure stepped closer, its silhouette shifting, Mara's frame, her hair tangled, her face a hollow void. "Elise," it whispered, the sob from the recorder now a plea, soft and broken. The grayness surged, flooding her lungs, and she gasped, her vision blurring. "Mara," she choked, reaching out, but the figure's empty gaze held no mercy. It's warm inside. Mara's voice breathed, curling through the mist, a lie wrapped in comfort. The villagers shoved her forward, her knees hitting the edge of the mine. She screamed, the sound muffled by the grayness, as hands, human and not, pulled her in. The tunnel swallowed her, the dark closing like a fist, the hum a roar that drowned her cries. She fell, the ground rushing up, and landed hard, gravel biting her palms. The air was thick, cold, alive with whispers. "Stay, stay," and the figures loomed above her, their wheezing a chorus. Mara's shape knelt beside her, its void face tilting, and the grayness consumed her chest, her heart slowing to match the mountain's pulse. The villagers' lanterns faded above, their chant a distant murmur, leaving her to the dark. Elise clawed at the dirt, her gray fingers crumbling, but the tunnel held her, its breath a weight she couldn't escape. Mara's whisper lingered, a promise of peace she couldn't trust, and the hum sealed her in, claiming her as its own. Chapter 10. The Mountain's Womb. The tunnel's darkness swallowed Elise whole, a void so thick it pressed against her skin like wet earth. She hit the ground hard, gravel cutting into her gray palms, the ropes still dangling from her wrists, frayed and useless. The air was cold, heavy with the stench of rot and stone, and the hum roared around her, a living pulse that shook the walls, her bones, her skull. Above, the village's lanterns were gone, their chants silenced, leaving her alone with the mountain's breath. She clawed at the dirt, her gray fingers crumbling at the tips, the numbness now a shroud over her chest, her throat. "No," she rasped, her voice a faint echo, but the tunnel answered with whispers. "Stay, stay," weaving through the hum like threads of a web. She tried to stand, her legs trembling, but the ground shifted, tilting downward, pulling her deeper. She slid, gravel scraping her knees, until she landed in a cavern. A vast, jagged womb carved into the mountain's heart. The air here was colder, a frost that burned, and her flashlight was lost, leaving only a faint glow from the walls, veins of ore glinting like eyes in the dark. She blinked, her vision blurring, and saw them, skeletal figures lining the cavern, their forms dust and bone, their heads bowed as if in prayer. They wheezed, a chorus of broken breaths, and the hum pulsed through them, binding them to the stone. Her stomach twisted. These were the trapped, the ones Mara had written about, the mountain's eternal debt. A shape moved closer, its silhouette soft against the gloom. Mara, or what had been Mara, her frame slight, her hair a tangled veil. She knelt beside Elise, her face a hollow void, eyeless, lipless, yet serene. "Elise," she whispered, the sob from the recorder now a lullaby, curling through the air. Elise reached out, her gray hand shaking, but the cold surged, locking her arm in place. "Mara," she choked, tears freezing on her cheeks. "What did it do to you?" Mara's form tilted its head, its void gazing into her. "It's peaceful here," it breathed, the words a lie she couldn't unhear. The grayness flooded her lungs, a tide that drowned her breath, and she gasped, her chest heaving against the weight. The cavern trembled, dust sifting from above, and the figures stirred, their wheezing sharpening into a chant. "Stay, join." As the hum became a roar, a breath exhaled from the mountain's core. Elise fell back, her body sinking into the dirt, the grayness climbing her face, numbing her lips, her eyes. She clawed at the ground, but her fingers dissolved into dust, merging with the stone. The cold wasn't cold anymore. It was nothing, a stillness that filled her veins. She saw Mara's hand, skeletal, gray, reach for her, guiding her deeper, and the cavern closed in, its walls pulsing like flesh. Her heartbeat slowed, sinking with the hum, and she felt it, the mountain's breath flowing through her, claiming her. She didn't scream, couldn't, as the grayness sealed her eyes shut, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. The dust rose, swirling around her, and she exhaled, not air, but a faint cloud of ash, joining the cavern's haze. Her body hardened, fusing with the dirt, the stone, until she was no longer Elise, but part of it, part of them. Above, the villagers knelt at the mine's entrance, their lanterns dim, their heads bowed. The shaman scattered the last coca leaves, his chant a murmur of thanks. The hum softened, a satisfied sigh, and the mist thickened, hiding the scar from view. They rose, their faces blank, and shuffled back to Kolupata, the debt paid once more. In the cavern, Elise's form stilled, her gray face frozen in the dirt, her mouth open in an endless breath. Mara's shape lingered beside her, whispering softly, and the figures resumed their vigil, their wheezing a hymn to the mountain's womb. She was theirs now, forever exhaling, forever bound. Chapter 11. The Stillness. Dawn crept over Kolupata, painting the jagged peaks in a faint gold that barely touched the village below. The mist had lifted, leaving the air crisp and clear, the mountain's scar of a mine softened by the morning light. The hum was gone, replaced by a stillness so deep it seemed the earth held its breath. The adobe huts stood silent, their tin roofs glinting, smoke curling lazily from chimneys as if nothing had changed. The alpacas chewed grass near stone walls, their dark eyes vacant, and the villagers moved through their routines with a quiet that felt practiced, rehearsed. Elise's shack stood empty, its door ajar, the ruins inside untouched since the night before. The cracked walls bore faint traces of black sludge, now dried and flaking, and the frost on the shattered window had melted, leaving only smears of dirt. Her jeep remained at the village's edge, its slashed tires sagging, but her gear, laptop, recorder, Mara's journal, was gone, spirited away in the night. A faint breeze swept through, carrying the scent of coca and earth, and the shack settled into the landscape, another relish of the mountain's toll. Doña Rosa shuffled past, her shawl tight around her shoulders, her face unreadable. She glanced at the shack, then away, her hands busy with a bundle of firewood. The old woman from the market sat grinding coca leaves, her rhythm unbroken, her eyes fixed on her work. The shaman stood by the stone altar, sweeping away the last of the coca offerings, his milky gaze drifting to the mine before returning to the ground. No one spoke of the night, of the lanterns, the ropes, the gray woman they'd given to the dark. It was done, The debt paid, and silence was their shield. Life resumed its slow pulse. A man led a donkey laden with potatoes down the path, his poncho flapping in the breeze. Women wove cloth in doorways, their fingers deft, their heads bowed. Children darted between huts, their laughter sharp but fleeting, swallowed by the vastness of the peaks. The village exhaled, its tension easing, the mountain's wrath stilled for another generation. They moved as if Elise had never been, her name erased from their tongues, her story buried with the others. By midday, a new figure appeared, a miner, young and wiry, his truck rattling up the trail from the valley. He parked near the market, stepping out with a clipboard and a curious frown. Dust clung to his boots as he approached the old woman with the coca leaves, his Spanish clipped and accented. "Buenos dias," he said, tipping his hat. "Heard there's old tunnels up here. Silver, maybe. Worth checking." The old woman's hands paused, her eyes flicking up to him, then to the mountain. She spat into the dirt, a gesture sharp with warning. "La montaña toma lo que se le debe," she said, her voice low, the same words she'd given Elise. The miner frowned, glancing at the scar in the distance, but shrugged it off, scribbling a note. "Just a look," he said, turning away. "No harm in that." The villagers watched him go, their faces blank, their silence a wall. He trudged up the path, his figure shrinking against the mountain's bulk, and disappeared into the mist that lingered near the mine. The old woman resumed her grinding. The shaman scattered a fresh coca leaf, and the village settled back into its rhythm, undisturbed. They knew he'd hear it soon enough, the hum, the whispers, the breath that waited. Chapter 12. The eternal breath years had passed since Elise's gray form sank into the mountain's womb, and Kulupata wore time like a shroud, unchanging, unyielding. The adobe huts stood weathered but resolute, their tin roofs dulled by sun and wind. The mist came and went, draping the village in its familiar haze, and the mountain loomed as ever, its scar of a mine a silent testament to the debt it claimed. The villagers moved through their days, grinding coca, weaving cloth, tending alpacas, with a rhythm that masked the weight of their secret. The hum had faded to a memory, a whisper only the old ones felt in their bones. The seasons turned, and the village grew quieter, its children fewer, its elders bent lower. The miner who'd come asking about silver never returned, another name swallowed by the mountain, his truck left to rust at the trail's end. Doña Rosa was gone now, her shack taken by a younger family, and the shaman's altar stood abandoned, its coca leaves scattered by the wind. Yet the stillness held, a fragile peace bought with blood, and the villagers guarded it with their silence. On a late afternoon, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the peaks. A boy, 10, maybe 11, wandered from the village, his bare feet kicking dust as he chased a stray alpaca up the path. His name was Mateo, his eyes bright with curiosity, his laughter a rare sound in Chulupata's hush. The alpaca darted toward the mine, and he followed, unmindful of the warnings whispered by his grandmother. "No vayas allá," words he'd heard but never heeded. The mine entrance loomed ahead, its rotting timbers sagging, the dark mouth exhaling a faint chill. Mateo stopped, his breath fogging, the alpaca forgotten, as a soft sound drifted from the void. A moan, low and mournful, like a voice calling through the stone. He tilted his head, frowning, closer, the gravel crunching under his feet. A moan sharpened, a whisper threading through it. Mateo, his name, soft and sweet, like his mother's lullaby. He froze, his heart thudding, but the sound pulled at him, gentle, insistent. He peered into the dark, squinting, and saw a flicker, a shape moving deep within, tall and thin, its outline blurred. "¿Quién está ahí?" he called, his voice small but steady. The whisper grew, a chorus now. "Mateo, come." And the tom returned, faint at first, then stronger, a pulse that stirred the dust around him. In the mountain's womb, far below, Elise's gray form lay fused with the stone, her mouth open in an endless exhale, dust drifting from her lips like breath. Beside her, Mara's shape wheezed softly, their voices woven into the cavern's hymn. Dozens, hundreds, a legion of the taken, bound to the dark. The hum pulsed through them, a living thread, and Elise's eyeless face twitched, sensing the boy above, his warmth a spark in the cold. Mateo took another step, the mind's edge inches from his toes. The whispers swelled, a song that wrapped around him, promising peace, belonging. He smiled, a child's smile, trusting and pure, and leaned forward, the dark reaching up to meet him. The hum roared, a breath exhaled from the mountain's core, and the ground trembled, dust sifting from the timbers. From the village, a woman's cry cut through the stillness. Mateo's grandmother, her shawl flapping as she ran up the path. "Mateo, no!" she screamed, her voice raw, but it was too late. The boy stepped into the mine, his small figure swallowed by the void, the whispers fading to silence. The hum softened, a satisfied sigh, and the mountain stilled, its scar unblinking in the fading light. The grandmother fell to her knees, clawing at the gravel, her wails echoing across Kulupata. The villagers emerged from their huts, their faces blank, their eyes averted. They knew the debt had stirred, the cycle begun anew. The old woman from the market spat into the dirt, muttering, "La montaña toma lo que se le debe," her hands resuming their grinding, relentless. Deep in the cavern, Mateo's form sank into the dust, his breath slowing, grayness threading up his small hands. Elise's shape turned, her hollow gaze fixed on him, and her exhale joined his.